Hey, good afternoon. It's a busy week. We've got first estimate of Q3 GDP that we'll cover here today, and then an earnings update in our question of the week, which is quite the week as far as companies reporting earnings. My name is Brandon Steele, financial advisor with Mainsail Financial Group here in Bellevue. And our goal every Thursday at 3 is to bring to you the market news, data, and trends we're watching. And as always, weed out a bit of the noise, which is ever prevalent these days. So we'll jump right in, but we have some big items to cover. Not a lot of different pieces, but some big items to cover. And before I get to those two, I want to start with some of the more nuanced pieces, which number one was consumer confidence. Consumer confidence came out on Tuesday, slightly under expectations. This is important to kind of keep note of, but it's not necessarily a market driving factor. It just means that generally speaking, us are maybe a little bit concerned about where the market is and, the economy and what's going on. So again, slightly under expectations, but I believe that's kind of been the case for a little while here. New home sales were down for the month, but actually slightly above expectations. So the housing market, and again, here in Washington State, or at least Seattle, Bellevue area, we're not feeling it a whole lot. But across the country, housing market is definitely slowed down quite a bit. So, when we talk about these housing data points, it's interesting being where we are because we're not feeling it maybe nearly as much, but certainly across the country, it is a bigger deal. And in fact, there are pockets around here too where, it is being felt a little bit more heavily. If you were to go sell your home, I can tell you a couple client stories on that front. You may know that, it is having an impact for sure. And again, new home sales, I think, shows that data here a little bit. But again, slightly higher than expected, which, maybe with a grain of salt, maybe a good sign. But I think there's still more room there to go. All right. Jobless claims came out today, by the way. I'll touch on that briefly. Jobless claims came out at 217,000, slightly higher than last month. So, I guess just barely higher though. So I don't think there's a whole lot to address there, but the jobs stuff is really, really important. It's a big area we're watching because as we consider whether we may be in a recession, when that comes, whether it's early next year, late next year, whatever the case might be, the labor market is an area that has shown really strong signs. And again, when we start to see cracks there, maybe signs that it's, moving up the docket, so to speak. All right, but the big thing to cover this week was just today, Thursday, we had the first estimates of Q3 GDP, and we showed growth of 2.6% for Q3 here in 2022. So this is really important. I think, the reason I wanted to touch on this is because we've been talking a lot about recession this year, obviously. Again, by the textbook definition of recession, technically we saw it earlier on in this year. I'm not trying to say and deny that we're in a recession or that a recession is coming. I just think that there are other factors to look at with this because the group that determines a recession, GDP is on the list of numbers they look at, but it's at the bottom. So although there's a simple version of a recession that we read about in the textbooks, at the end of the day, a recession is actually determined by an organization, and GDI, gross domestic income, is one of the biggest things that they look at. So anyways, all that to say that GDP, after a lull, is showing some signs of growth, which is great to see. Now, whether or not that continues, again, I think that might be a factor as we move into this potential recession in 2023 as well. But nonetheless, it's good to see some growth this past quarter. And remember, this is the first estimate, so there will be revisions. We'll see where those fall, but it is good to see this number come out. And if you've been following the markets the last couple of weeks, the markets have really taken off quite a bit, even with some negative news on earnings, which I'll get to here in a minute. The markets are kind of shrugging it off so far. Anyways, with all of that, before I get into the earnings, I want to talk about next week because next week is a big one. So definitely join us next Thursday at 3. We've got PCE price index, we've got spending, we've got jobs week, which is the big one, but we've also got, you guessed it, the Fed coming up on Wednesday. So join us next Thursday. We're going to talk all about further updates on earnings. We're going to talk about the jobs data that may be coming and then the Fed decision all in 1 week. It's going to be a lot. But before we get there, we have a great question of the week here this Thursday from Nate. And basically, Nate was asking about earnings updates. Here we are about 2 weeks or so into the earnings season. So there's still a lot to go. But here we are, Thursday, October 27th. And we've had, this week especially, was a huge week of earnings. I mean, we had Microsoft, Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, you name it. The big tech week was this week, and so it's a very relevant topic today. So here's what I want to share is that so far, if you've been following, you may know that these big tech companies are showing pretty bad signs of earning for the most part. To give you an idea, like Meta. Meta reported last night. They're down, I think, 22% or something like that here on Thursday. Microsoft reported the other day. They were down pretty big. Google as well. So the tech earnings have been pretty rough. And these are some of the biggest companies, obviously not in the US, but in the world. And because of that, we're seeing some of the index drag, right? Some of the S&P, for instance, has pulled back a little bit on these tech earnings. The NASDAQ has pulled back a little bit on these tech earnings. But here's what I want to share. This is where the attention goes, is always on the tech side. But we've been talking forever about looking at value. And what has worked the last 2 years may not be what works the next two. So here's the other side of the equation. Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Costco, Harley Davidson, all these companies have shown strong numbers. These companies have beat their earnings and really shown some strength during this earnings season. So here we are with two very different sides of the equation, depending on what you're looking at. But of course, the focus, the media is really spending a lot of time on the big tech side of it. So, that's what we're hearing a lot about. But at the end of the day, there are some glimmers of hope as well with some companies that are a little more, let's say, boring, but doing very well. So I think that this is a really important theme to watch. It's something we've been, focused on throughout 2022, but something that we think may continue to get even more steam, is that the value side of the equation could certainly be worth continuing to explore, because again, they're not as reliant on the cost of capital is one of the big things. A lot of these companies may have fixed expenses, right? So a lot of these things don't impact them as much as they might these tech giants. So something to definitely keep an eye on. Again, this week has been very, very interesting to watch as far as earnings go, and especially the tech earnings side of it. Maybe just to back up here, it's not all bad. Netflix reported last week they showed some subscriber growth, so Netflix finally got a breather after a pretty tough year. But it's a trend that if we still have these challenges, may kind of continue. So definitely something to watch. And the interest rate changes impact this quite a bit. So my question to you ahead of next week is, what do you think the Fed is going to do on Wednesday? Fed decision is on Wednesday. I'd love to hear what you think will happen. And we will be back next Thursday to report on what did happen and what the impacts may mean moving forward. If it helps, a little glimpse. I believe they're going to hike again. They've projected 75 basis points and a 50 basis point hike. That could be the case. But nonetheless, I think at least 50 basis points on Wednesday. So time will tell. We will see. We'll be back next Thursday to talk about what happened. In the meantime, have a great upcoming weekend, and we'll see you next Thursday at 3.